that the season that we're looking at of last year actually had a little bit less overall in terms of the named systems than we would have gotten in an average year. So where are we now? Less overall in terms of the named systems than we would have gotten in an average year. So where are we now? Less overall in terms of the named systems than would experience around about 14 named storms. We out of that would get about 7 hurricanes. And then from those, we would have about 3 in terms of major hurricanes. Let me see the chart and what we're looking at here. So here we are back on the screen. So on the right side, we'll see where it shows in the orange bars the average year that we would experience. We're looking at here. The blue bars back on the screen. So on the right side, we'll see where the blue bars would indicate what we actually experienced last year. So we had 13 named storms. We had 5 hurricanes, and of those, we had 4 becoming major hurricanes. A little bit unusual in that we were equal with the average with major hurricanes, but we were below the average with our named storms. However, that's how it worked out last year, a season that showed that we experienced a little bit less than the average activity with named storms, but we had a severe system, as you see on the left, with Hurricane Melissa actually moving into Jamaica. Now, the forecast, looking at the outlook for 2026, we are seeing that we are expecting about 8 to 14 named storms. That takes us up to about the average, but really and truly, we're looking at a season that is a little bit less active than normal. Of these storms, between 3 and 6 could become hurricanes, and major hurricanes could account for about 1 to 3 of these systems that develop. And there is a strong possibility of this occurring because we have a 55% chance that the below active or below normal activity is what we will experience. There's a much smaller percentage probability of it being an average or a below average season. So looking a little bit at some of the factors that would influence the activity for a season, we first look at warm sea surface temperatures over the Atlantic and the Caribbean area. That's not what we're seeing on our chart here, but in the case of Melissa last year, we had very warm waters in the Caribbean Sea, as well as in the North Atlantic, that accounted for the strong development of the system into a major hurricane while it was over the Caribbean area. And so we are again expecting to experience warm sea surface temperatures in the Caribbean. In terms of the trade winds moving across the region, they are expected to be weak throughout the development region and throughout the hurricane season. And so that also contributes to a chance of very good activity, maybe even above average. But the overriding factor that we've been looking at is the El Niño phenomenon, and El Niño conditions are growing stronger. They are actually developing now, expected to grow stronger and expected to dominate the picture and what we are expecting to experience during the course of 2026. So we are looking for a very active hurricane season, not a very active, but a below average activity because of the strong performance of the El Niño that is expected. So just a quick look at what that El Niño is about. I'm only looking at it just taking a snapshot here because I'm sure Professor Taylor will be taking us a little bit more in depth into this phenomenon. But But the El Nino is expected to develop by July and is likely to intensify during the hurricane season and continue right throughout the period. El Nino conditions tend to support less tropical storms and hurricanes, primarily because of the hostile upper level winds that are created over the Atlantic region that do not favor significant development of those tropical cyclones. So we're not looking to see the upper atmosphere supporting that kind of strong development because of the existence of the El Nino. The stronger the El Nino episode, the less likely storms will evolve into major hurricanes. So that's how I wanted to start, just to lay the foundation as to what we are expecting and what is likely to influence the activity for this hurricane season. And now maybe let me come back to Dion Jackson Miller to introduce your next speaker. Maybe if Professor Taylor is right on hand, he could just jump right in to continue this setting of context. Okay, Dion, you're right here. Great. Over to you.
Yeah, so sorry about that, team as well as viewers. We still have been trying to sort out some tech issues on my side. Prof. Taylor, please go right ahead.
Hi. Are you hearing me? I'm sorry, I was not.
Yeah, Prof. Taylor, and today seems to be one of those days.
One of those days, but we're going to push through. We're going to push through.
Let me just hand over right to you.
All right, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to pick up where Evan left off. So he spoke about El Nino, and of course he spoke about in the context of hurricane seasons. And as you know, I'm a climate change scientist. And so if I was somebody out there listening, the real question I would be asking is El Nino, hurricane season, climate change. So we're at the start of a hurricane season. Really, what are we preparing for? Just wanted to make sure that we are all at least know what we're talking about when we're talking about an El Nino. One quick slide, pretty slide, I hope it conveys. That orange blob means there's this warm water in the equatorial Pacific. So that's the equator, and you see this warm water. And because we don't normally have warm water so far east, which is to the right of the diagram in the Pacific, you end up getting rising air, especially in the central Pacific. That rising air has to fall somewhere, and part of where it falls is over the Caribbean. And so when you get that falling air, you suppress the clouds. Of course, no clouds, it feels hotter. And of course, you suppress the rainfall. And El Nino, sorry, Sir Evan spoke about the impact on hurricanes. All right, but to the question that I think I want to just quickly cover. So we hear about El Nino, we hear about hurricane season. I am introducing climate change. The real question is what we're really preparing for. Well, quickly, here are the 6 things science says that you must keep in mind when you have all of these things in the mix. First one, even with El Nino, climate change still a keep. I hope that is okay to use that in this context. So all the things you remember about climate change, the hotter days and nights, the higher frequency of drought, the heavy rainfall, the potential for more intense hurricanes, and the higher sea levels and storm surge, still keeping. And I want to pick up on that more intense hurricane because, you know, we're going into hurricane season. And actually just want to read one phrase from a press release that both UWI and the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology put out the 21st of April, trying to warn about the season ahead. In addition to contributing to very hot days and nights and more heat waves, the very warm Caribbean Sea, due in part to climate change, may provide windows of opportunity for a very strong hurricane to develop, notwithstanding El Nino's dampening effect. For this reason, the region can never let its guard down. It only takes one hurricane to cause immense economic setback. So though an El Nino may dampen hurricane, if we get one, the climate change has the potential to make it intense. So first thing, even with El Nino, climate change still a keep. Second, layering is the name of the game. What we have is climate change setting the background. It's the stage. Then El Nino coming and playing on top of it. And when you layer one on top of the other, one of the things is extreme heat. We know this. Guess what? 2024 was the warmest year on record. And why was 2024 the warmest year on record? Well, where WMO tells us 2024 was the hottest year on record because of the combination of the 2023-24 El Nino and human-induced climate change. Or NASA, the strong El Nino that began in 2023 helped nudge global temperatures in 2024 above previous records. So layering is the name of the game. We have to think about that. Climate change sets the stage, El Nino plays on it, extreme heat is one. Third, not everything is known. It's a new era. Truth is, the interaction of climate change and a super El Nino is brand new territory. And so things that we expect to happen may just not happen. In fact, what you see on the screen is a new study we had produced, and it came out earlier this year that says, you know, normally when you have very, very warm waters in the Caribbean Sea and in the Atlantic, you can use it to say we should have a strong early rainfall season. I want to put out there already that the Caribbean is already showing signs that that kind of historical relationship is breaking down. And you know that May, June is our early rainfall season. And maybe the absence of this early rainfall season so far, or the depression, may be something to worry about as well. If we don't get the rain now, how we go through the dry period in summer, how we manage later in the year. All right, but not everything is known. It's a new era. So we need to bear that in mind. Science tells us. 4, invest for the long haul, not just the next few months. We're talking about preparedness, but we're talking about it in hurricane season timescales. Truth is, when you have an El Nino, it increases the chance, and you see the WMO, what it has put out, of 2027 being the next record-breaking warm year. The El Nino will start, once it gets going and starts, as Sir Evan said, it will peak towards the end of this year into next year. And so we will have an El Nino around in 2027. And the feeling is that the warmest part of this El Nino is going to be next year. So as we're talking about preparing, whatever preparing we're doing now, we must keep the fact that it has to last us into next year. So invest for the long haul, not the next few months. Almost done. 5, not just Jamaica. Like climate change, El Nino is global. And the point is, we're keeping our eyes on El Nino in Jamaica, but El Nino is happening everywhere else. And so it's going to impact rainfall and drought, drought in some of the food producing areas. What I have on the screen is that the Panama Canal, it has to begin thinking about the El Nino, because the last El Nino, the water levels fell so low that we couldn't transit ships through there. Well, that's a logistics problem. And so if we think that we're preparing to rebuild from Melissa later down the year with goods and things that are to be transported through the Panama Canal, well, we have to keep our eye on what the El Nino is doing to the Panama Canal, because those timelines for rebuilding may not be. So keep our eye on what El Nino is doing elsewhere. Last one, other things are converging. It's not just climate. And I'm kind of ending with a Taylor quote. Surging global oil prices and a brewing El Nino climate phenomenon are colliding, creating a severe threat to Caribbean food security and household budgets. The region's heavy reliance on imported staples means that spikes in fuel and shipping costs combined with El Nino-induced droughts will potentially drive food and electricity prices to unsustainable levels. You know what I'm saying? In this kind of scenario, those worst hit by Melissa are going to be hit again because other things are converging. So let me answer the question I began with. So what must we be preparing for when you have El Nino, hurricanes, climate change in the mix? Prepare for the hurricanes still. They may be dampened, but climate change still keeping, and if we get one, it can become intense. Prepare for extreme heat. It's the layering. Prepare to be surprised. We don't know everything. Prepare with next year in mind, not just the next few months. Prepare for disruptions to food, energy, and supply chains. It's happening elsewhere. And prepare to protect the most vulnerable first, because they're already hit and they're going to be hit with a double whammy. If the lesson of Melissa after Beryl was that recovery can't wait, then the lesson of El Nino after Melissa is that preparedness cannot wait. Thank you so much, Dion. I hope I've finished setting up the context.
No, that was absolutely great. Thank you so much, Prof. And a lot of what you said and a lot of what Evan said, in fact, are going to feed into some of the later discussions. Let me jump straight into our discussion now on marine and coastal ecosystems. I'm going to ask Weber to lead us off on this, because what we heard, after is that, boy, the coastline up. But I don't know if you can give us a little bit more of a technical and a scientific and a knowledgeable basis to say that, Prof. And, where exactly are we now, about seven months plus after Melissa? Prof. Weber.
Thank you very much, Dion, and good afternoon to our viewers, listeners, as we go through the difficulties, but we will overcome. I want to start by saying that there are three ecosystems that we need to focus on: our coral reefs, our mangroves, and our seagrasses, which together provide protection. And as the scene has been set in terms of things changing, we need to figure out how will those things be impacted by, and how will they impact the coastal areas that we're trying to protect. Well, coral reefs have always been important in terms of reducing wave action and reducing the storms that can come ashore. Up to 80% of what can be protected can be done from the coral reef systems. Having them there makes a difference. If they weren't there, we would have major difference. And it's because of their three-dimensional structure, meaning think of a mountain on land. As the wind comes up against it with some trees, it slows down the wind and it changes what that wind can do. It's the same with water, with currents, with waves. And a hurricane or any kind of tropical storm produces those kind of waves. What we've done is we've looked at what NEPA has put out. NEPA, in their 2020 report for State of Coral Reefs, has stated that the coral reefs in Jamaica are in a bad shape. This is before Melissa. Of 12 sites that were there, none of them were good or very good. A few were fair. Most were poor, which is the orange, and those that are red are critical, meaning we're not in a good place. The reefs are never in a good place when this kind of thing is happening. And if you look at the history of it, from 2011 to where we are now, the blue bars there that's coral. And it's gone up a little in 2016 and back down in 2020. So we don't have the kind of coral cover we need to. And if you look at the lines that are there, the herbivorous fish and the commercial fish, those are all features of what happens with a coral reef. Those are all declining as well. So in 2020, before Melissa, we know we have problems. So although our map of Jamaica, and this is from a 2021 work we did with Steve Schill, with TNC and the university, there are reefs all around Jamaica, yes, but their condition, very poor. If you ask somebody what the state is, they're going to say that those reefs are unable to manage any storm that comes along, and less so. Mangroves, same thing. From as far back as 89, there were 20 mangrove areas around Jamaica, and they all had some kind of attention. It's about 9,000 hectares. Well, over time, we added some mangroves based on restoration, but we also recategorized. Forestry took over a lot of the mangrove discussion and the management, and small areas, 2.5 hectares, were included. So we got up to about 15,000 hectares. But again, using imagery and drones that we now are using, TNC and UWI have come up with that 12,131 hectares, which means we have about the same amount of mangroves, or a little more than we used to. So the forestry map from 2023 tells us where we have mangroves and that they're in pretty good condition where they exist. The latest image from the same TNC UWI work tells us that we have a wide coverage of mangrove, only about 2% of the coastline, but it's there for protection because when mangroves are there, it prevents storm surges from coming on shore. And finally, seagrasses. Well, believe it or not, we've actually done enough work in terms of research to look at how seagrasses change or disappear with hurricanes. This is after a model drawn up by McLaren, etc., of Gilbert, Ivan, and Dean, looking at how Bluefields has changed. And I draw your attention to the hurricanes that would have come in 2004 and 2007. On the right, you will see some green patches. That is areas with seagrass. The yellow patches have no seagrass. In 2002, it begins to change. And you notice in 2008, 2010, it gets worse even after the hurricanes have passed. What this study has told us is that it takes 8 to 10 years for seagrasses to recover from hurricanes. But in between hurricanes, they really seem to have a problem with the flow from rivers, those little black dots. That's the source of a river that's coming into the bay. So we know that our seagrasses have some issues, and we're going to have to modify how we work with them. I'll stop there in terms of where were we before Melissa, because I know our colleagues want to contribute. I'll come back with where are we after Melissa. Thank you, Dion.
Me to comment. I think that the presentations that we've just heard from, not just from Professor Weber, but from Evan and Prof. Taylor, have been very instructive and insightful. And I think that what we're hearing is that this is why the environment, when I say the environment, this is why it is so important to protect the existing environment, because when we have things like hurricanes, stresses like hurricanes or higher sea surface temperatures, it further stresses these environments that play such an important role. So mangroves, we've heard, seagrass, we've heard, are very important in protecting coastal communities, in protecting infrastructure. That's most of it is on the coast. So I think that it is important that what this lesson is, what Professor Weber has highlighted in terms of his presentation, is extremely important for us to consider going forward, that when we're looking at development, planning, permissions, and so forth, we need to focus on protecting rather than allowing for these ecosystems to be I'm sorry, I'm a little distracted by all that's happening. But it is important for us to focus on protecting these ecosystems because they play a very important role in protecting us from even further harm, environmental harm. And I think it's also important, and we'll hear this further on in the conversation, I'm sure, that Hurricane Melissa it didn't create Jamaica's environmental vulnerabilities. What I think it did was exposed it and it amplified it. And many of the impacts that we witnessed have been the result of decisions and omissions that have accumulated over decades. And so I don't want to go much further because I know that there will be other questions, but I think we have lost Dion.
No,
Dion,
man,
you're back?
I'm right here, I'm right here.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Mackenzie, let me ask you to jump in here and comment as well, if you could, on this area.
Yeah, thank you, Dion. The question of our coastal environment and coral reefs and mangroves and seagrass beds, as Prof indicated, they are critical because they add and support the natural resilience of the country, certainly in the coastal environment. And sad to say, and I mean, this information has been out for a long time, as Prof indicated, the classification index for coral reefs are up to the 2020 report was poor, but even with recent data, the 2024 data, the coral reef health index, it's now classified as critical. So that's even a lower grade than the poor state. Unfortunately, we know we've spoken a lot about the various pressures, and Prof referred to them. But then again, the question of the climate impact, the temperature. I mean, we have, meaning Nepal, we have 24 temperature data loggers located right around our coastal environment of Jamaica. And the sad truth, I mean, I suppose the models predicted, the actual data is showing the gradual increase in sea surface temperature. So that, no doubt, is having an impact on our reef environment. And so when we had the question of Melissa, well, hurricane impact again, that's a double whammy. So we are, I mean, it's not good news. And the Hurricane Melissa, based on the report that we're receiving and the assessment so far, the coast of St. James was significantly impacted by Hurricane Melissa. And then, of course, the western sections of St. Mary. Somehow, apparently, sections of the St. Anne reefs were not so much disturbed and toppled over by Hurricane Melissa. We're yet to complete the assessment on the south coast. I mean, we have background information relating to the reefs out at Bluefields. That's the area that would have been direct hit. But we're still to complete that assessment. So, I mean, there's some lessons learned, if I might wrap up. I mean, one area is how we can, in the face of these hurricanes, how we can go out immediately after to support the salvaging of some of these reef structures, because apparently there is a little hope where that is concerned. If we're able to salvage some, I mean, restructure them, paste them up down in the substrate and so on within 45 days. And I think the discussion now is in terms of going forward. I mean, how we respond to that. And happily, I think there is some effort for training and sensitization and building up a brigade to support that effort going forward.
Here's
what there for the time being.
Yeah, thank you so much. Here's one of the things I think is important. In the first seminar that we did, where we looked at infrastructure, the development along the coastline was a big part of talking about. And I'm wondering how these various conversations intersect. How should they intersect? And perhaps I'll go back to Dr. Rodriguez Moody on this. And then I don't know if Prof. Burban, Prof. Taylor want to comment on that as well, because are those different sectors talking to each other, and are we really producing an integrated look of what we want to see when we talk about coastal development and coastal protection? Are we integrating the environmental discussions we're having here, the climate change discussions, with the infrastructure and building and housing type discussions? Dr. Rodriguez Moody, what do you think?
Good question, Dion, because sometimes it does seem like it is not necessarily working together. We hear about areas that are declared protected, and then we hear about a development, a permit application for these particular areas, or infrastructure being placed. We've seen things like, for example, NWC mowing down mangroves in the protected area in Palisadoes Port Royal protected area because they needed to put in pipes. So, I think that this is something that there needs to be greater synergies and conversations between all the entities. The NRCA Act binds the crown, which means that all government entities are responsible to have to comply with the law. And so I think that this is something that is an area that needs significant improvement, that in one breath we cannot be speaking about with the need to have all of these different protection mechanisms and conserve these different areas, and then allowing these different activities that are causing harm and further exacerbating our vulnerability to these kind of climate stresses and storms.
Yeah, Prof. Taylor, want to comment as well? I'm really talking about the integration of all these discussions.
Right. I mean, and I think the fact that you are asking the question almost answers the question that you are asking. And I don't know, the point that I think I'm trying to make is that Melissa has taught us some significant lessons. And one of them is that why we need this kind of systems approach to dealing with things. It cannot be individual plans. So one place can't plan with while another does not know those plans, or those plans are not discussed across the entire system. And I think that is what we need to take as, a significant lesson. And especially now that we are in a whole phase of rebuilding and recovery, you shouldn't have to ask that question, is what I am saying.
And yet I am. Prof. Weber, comment?
Thanks, Dan. And I want to build on where our colleagues have just left off, because it is not all doom and gloom, and we do need to do a lot more together to make a difference. And I think that's why the HEDE actually has the universities on it to provide information. And I think it is the data that tells us where we're going. Allow me to give you a few more data points that I think will help share this situation. So here is a little diagram of what happened in terms of the temperatures. The temperatures that we were collecting, and Anthony spoke about a project that NEPA and the UWI are doing just off the Port Royal Keys. And the temperatures have been 30 and 31 degrees, which are way too high if you expect corals to survive. And if what Evan and Michael are saying is that the temperatures are going up, you're going to have even more problems. You're going to have even more coral loss. But that red line in the middle that I'm showing you was the day of the hurricane. There was a drop from 30 or 31 degrees to 28 degrees. The hurricane itself produced a temperature change. And all of a sudden, we stopped seeing some of the bleaching that would happen. So we know that if we were able to manage that temperature change, we wouldn't have the coral issue. So it is giving you the ammunition to have the discussion that you're talking about. And again, where it happened. So we know that in Portland, in Boscoville, minimal damage to the reefs there. But in White House, in Lucy, major damage. And we know that we had issues with those. And the same thing is true of mangroves. That is Savlamar just before Melissa. And the role of the mangroves there is to protect all that community behind it. This is the same shot just after. And the devastation would have been far worse. Now, the mangroves themselves took a hint, but they were protecting the coastline. The parity situation is the one that tells us where we should and should not be building. Because, yes, there were no mangroves on the seaside of this of parity. Hurricane came through, Melissa did its damage. Everything there on the left is gone. The mangroves themselves were destroyed. In fact, we had 100% destruction of some of the mangroves there. But it means those had no protection. Those houses, whatever was there on the left, had no protection. And I draw your attention to the opening in the gap. That piece of land had a natural opening, which was filled in to build housing, to build whatever. All of a sudden, hurricane comes along and it says, no, there should be an opening there, and it puts the opening back. So we need to recognize where we ought to and not to build. Jamaica used to have a setback limit of 48 meters or 45 meters. These are like 45 millimeters from the water's edge. We need to decide, are we going to enforce the legislation that we have, or are we going to continue playing around with it?
No, and that sounds like a rhetorical question. I wish it were. And that actually leads us very nicely into a discussion about forest cover as well as mangroves. Let me just say, in the meantime, I know people have started to drop some comments and questions in the chat. Thank you so much. Please continue doing so. I'll come to them as soon as possible and try to share as many of them as possible and ask the panelists to comment. We have some really interesting ones, including ones about frogs and data centers. So panelists, get ready for those. But let me first go and talk a little bit more about what's happening with forests. And let me go first now to Mr. Jerome Smith, who is Principal Director of Forestry, because we had heard some numbers that sounded pretty crazy in terms of loss of forest, 76 to 100% affected in some areas. But Mr. Smith, you're the expert. Let me hand over to you and tell us where we are some months, 7+ months after Melissa.
Thank you, Dion. Good afternoon, colleagues. Dion is quite correct. We did have a discussion early post Melissa about the destructive nature of Melissa and the impact it had on our forests. 7 months in, I don't know if I should say proud, but I must say that the information presented initially is real. When we look back at the data we gathered between the first week in November until the end of December, it was concluded that over 300 hectares, almost 300 hectares of our forests. And for those who don't know what a hectare is 2.2 meters. So we're talking over 500,000 acres of our forests were impacted by Melissa. This is a percentage of 50%, about 51% of our total forest cover. When we looked at the analysis, the most heavily impacted forest type was our disturbed broadleaf forests and our secondary forests. And for those who know forest jargon, you'll know that the secondary forests and the disturbed broadleaf forests are not the pristine forests. So it shows that the forests that are not in the optimal state were the most disturbed. And for us, that's not surprising. And based on the track of the hurricane, we found that the disruption was along the path of the eye, which came from the southwest and went to the northeast. There were two segments of destruction. We looked at destruction for about 51 to 74%, and then we looked at forest destruction, which ranged at over 75 to 100%. And we found that within the footprint of the eye, which is about 45 kilometers on either side, everyone can tell me if I'm wrong, but a total of about 90 kilometers spanning the left and the perimeter of the eye, we found that we had the 76 to 100 percentile destruction. And this was mostly in the parishes of St. Elizabeth, St. James, Hanover, Trelawney. And what we found was that of the forest impacted, disturbed forests and secondary forests made up 50% of the total area of forest that were impacted. The good thing about being able to look back at it at this time was that in the initial assessments we had provided was based on remote sensing, basically using satellite imagery, flying drones where possible. But now we have actually had a chance to go in, and we did over 320 site confirmations. And what we're finding out of this site confirmation is that the remote sensing information is indeed correct. Of the 320 sites that we were able to do across the island, we've got a score of 161 of them showing severe impacts on the forest, which lines up with what the remote sensing data showed. And so, not surprisingly, we noted a heavy disturbance of the mangrove systems as well. Apparently 26%, the data is showing us that 26% of Jamaica's mangroves were impacted by Hurricane Melissa. And coming back from the data from the field, it is important to note that what we're talking about is not just isolated tree damage. We're looking at entire landscapes that have been removed, and the scale of the impact impacts not just the forest services, but the other critical services such as the watershed protection, slope stabilization, biodiversity conservation, and resilience to climate change as well. The scale of the damage just speaks to the fact that we cannot do business as usual as the forestry department. It's not just reforestation that will get us back from here, Diane. It will be a coordinated national restoration and recovery program. I'll say that. I'll stop here for now.
Wow, that sounds major. When you talk about that level of coordination and that level of destruction. So what does that mean then for instance, organizations like JET? Dr. Rodriguez Moody, again, throwing back to you on that.
Well, what does it mean for us? I think that
or for the public. Let me get in the firing line. But since you guys do speak for the on environmental issues, when you hear that, how do you see that translating into action?
Well, you know, as Jerome indicated, that it means that there's a lot of work that has to be done, right? And no, I don't think no single entity can really take this on, and we need to see more organizations working together. And this is where different NGOs and community-based organizations can also be a part of the efforts going forward. You know, I think that you have multiple fish sanctuaries that are already involved in things like coral reef replanting. You have other organizations involved in mangrove replanting. We're going to be hopefully working on that in some areas shortly. So I think that what it really means is that in one we do need to work together, and the government can't do it all on its own. That organizations do have a role to play, individuals do have a role to play, and can work together to really beef up. We need that protection in our environment, in our forests, because it plays such an important role, as we've been hearing, in terms of protecting our houses and protecting our infrastructure, our roads, our facilities. So it's a lot, I think, but what it's important to understand is that this is not a one-off thing, right? Well, the context that we've heard set by Prof. Taylor is that we're seeing layering, we're seeing year to year things changing, we're seeing surprises. And this is something that we need to be prepared, and we need to be putting the environment front and center in our decision-making process, in our actions, and so forth.
And I do want to go around the room on this issue of the replanting and the moving forward on the mangroves and the forests, because I mean, it connects with every single thing we're talking about. Prof. Webb, I see you came camera on. And what I'd love you to comment on, I know you probably have something specific to say, but
I do.
Just before you go, one of the things I'm curious about, because I'd heard you speak as well about mangrove replanting, and we heard Dr. Rodriguez Moody mention that as well. But it seems as with so many things in Jamaica, we've been doing projects on mangrove replanting. So we have one, for instance, that a lot of people have seen out by Palisados, and I know in a couple other areas. But why haven't we gone more in a I guess, more broad-based, more national, in a bigger way? How come we're not scaling those important projects?
And that's a really good question. So let me give you, again, thinking about it, and I think we're thinking on the same line. In fact, your panelists kind of segue into each other very nicely. So as you know, we do mangrove, seagrass, and coral reef restoration. And that's what we do at the Center for Marine Sciences, Life Sciences. Here are two examples of how we can do coral restoration. You can plant them as coral trees, or you can have them on strings, on lines. And the idea is to get them growing. But two things have to happen. It makes no sense growing corals and putting them back where they were dying before, because what you put back are going to die there as well. So you have to fix the problem that's there, whether it's sedimentation, whether it's eutrophication, sewage, or whatever. So big part of this is, where are you going to plant them back? And then two, we've been working with those corals that have been most hardy, have survived all of what we've thrown at them and still survive. We ought to be specific about those species being used in the restoration. But part of the problem is, how do we make sure that what we're doing can follow or can happen? Research as far back as 2012 tells us the greatest limitation to getting something like coral restoration is lack of funding. So money is the problem. Project continuity is another problem because JET, for instance, Teresa will tell you that money comes in and you get a good project and you do something. The money runs out and you have to sit and wait on the next project. So you live project to project to project. We need more continuity to get it done. Lack of follow-up, and that's between government and NGO and academia. We need to get rid of some of the government red tape, and there's some time constraints, and you can go down the line to see all the different things that are there, but there are some things that we can fix as we go along. The Marine Labs, Port Royal and Discovery, have 20,000 seedlings that we keep, and as a part of NEPA's no net loss policy, so wherever the mangroves have to be taken out, there is a no net loss policy. You have to put it back. So we have some ready to plant, and we've been helping with planting out. We've been providing the seedlings, providing the technology, and that's exactly what you're talking about, having it along the palisades. Now, those are areas that have been selected, and we could have done a lot more had we had the right support from government in terms of, if we had just put back some of the sediment that had been removed when they were doing the roads, we could have planted the entire area with mangroves. But no, we decided to do it in parts and in parcels here and there. But not to give up on it. We need to decide, how do we continue to do this? We have had success stories at Gallows Point, for instance. 4 months after replanting, we have seen restoration happening. So we need to take into consideration that restoration is possible, but replanting is not a cure-all. Sometimes you don't need to plant anything. Some things you just change the hydrology, allow the water to flow where it normally flowed, where we have stopped it, or where something like garbage or plastics have stopped it from happening. We need to decide, okay, we're going to restore what is there. And remember, if we're talking about carbon, when you replace, in terms of replanting, you can't replace what was there below ground, and that's been there for decades. All of a sudden, it's gone. So the big question, or the big thing I think everybody should be putting on the table is conservation should happen rather than restoration. Restoration should be the very last thing. We should try not to take it away. We do it with seagrasses as well, where we've lost seagrass beds and we've found ways to try and recover them. This is an example of one at RIU, which, I mean, RIU started as one of the worst hotels when it came to environmental practices. But they came along and they allowed us to replant some seagrasses in the grill. 20 years, 19 years later, here you see a lush seagrass bed from what was just plain nothing there before. So we need to get buy-in of public sector, private sector, hotels, so if tourism is what's using it. So we need to get everybody on board to work together to try and make these things happen.
All right, I saw Mr. Mackenzie trying to come in as well. Those slides are fascinating. Some of this, I mean, I've been covering environment for so many years and I still didn't know. Go
Right,
ahead.
so the point is, I think one of the takeaway from Prof. a while ago is that there is some hope, all is not lost. In the case of that wider area, the wider, and I use the word cockpit country, that wider cockpit country area, we've garnered funds from the JEF through the UNDP to implement a restoration type set of works in that particular area, Trelawney, St. James, Northern St. Elizabeth area. So it's focused a lot on livelihoods, supporting recovery of lives and livelihoods of the inhabitants. I mean, it's important in that regard, so that lives can be impacted and at the same time managing the recovery of the resources in that area. So that's a big effort. We've also earmarked another $8 million as effort to support a national ecosystem restoration plan initiative that's going to be rolled out over the next 3 to 4 years. And just for a little point, Leon, the mangrove area just outside of Falmouth, the Wings Morass, we've targeted that particular area. I mean, we have a problem with encroachments and illegal as well. And we've spoken about the approved developments and the potential impacts and how we made those decisions with respect to how we approve certain types of developments at particular locations. And we can go into a discussion with that, I mean, in the context of how NEPA approaches that. But in the case of Windsor Morass, I mean, we're going to be doing an effort for World Ocean Day, We have worked with UE to put in a bulldozer in that area to remove a large amount of solid waste, remove derelict structures, knock down illegal structures, and we're going to be replanting a particular area. And that's and I mean we have spoken about pilots in the past, but this is a real major effort for the protection of that Winston morass area, which is going to be declared a forest reserve. So we're going to have to put in some major fencing to prevent encroachment, and spending a lot of money in that regard. So the point is that, I mean, we have to be working together interagency wise and with all our stakeholders to bring the efforts to bear on the conservation in the first instance, as Prof mentioned, but ultimately, and in the face of these impacts, for restoration in the long term.
Okay, just before we continue, I want to make sure we drawing lines between the different parts of the discussion. So I do want to go back to Prof. Taylor and then Mr. Thompson in terms of the relationship between the tree planting, in particular the forest cover, for instance, mangrove cover, and some of the concerns both of you have been raising. Just before that, though, let me just start to introduce a couple of questions. Damien says one of the lessons learned from the hurricane is the importance of baseline data to document impact and identify what we need to do in the future. Are different groups collecting data? And if so, how is it shared? I don't know who wants to take that. Kind of sound like a UA person question. Dr. Weber, let me lob that one over to you.
I'll catch it. All right. So research is driven in many ways. There's personal research. I want to know why the grass is green and I could go study that. But how is that of benefit to my country? Focused research or applied research very often takes us to particular answers. The two need to go together. Because they're right, you need baseline to know that you've shifted from the baseline. Collecting those baseline data means somebody or some organization has to have the interest and has to have the equipment to go out there and start it. Now, Jamaica is a big country. You notice, we could tell you about where studies have been done. We did something recently that said, where have we done marine research? Guess what? It is around Port Royal, Discovery Bay, Alligator Head, Bluefields, areas that we either have a base to do the research or where we have, for instance, EIAs have sprung up and produced information. So yes, we do need to collect baseline data, and that will continue. Both terrestrial and marine, we need to have collection of data. That is continuing, but right now it is done on the basis of individuals and departments and interests, specific interests in specific locations. It really falls to NEPA, forestry, to the holistic studies. And I know that they're doing that because we partner with NEPA and with forestry to provide some of the students as well as some of the researchers to help them cover the bases that they want to cover. So I know that both Anthony and Jerome have an answer to give you on that.
Well, Evan Thompson, I see you coming in. Go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to point to the importance of data where the Meteorological Service is also concerned, because, you know, on a day-to-day basis, when weather occurs across the island, we take it upon ourselves to ensure that there are stations right across the country that are recording what is happening in the weather, and not just recording it for immediate passing it on to let us know what is happening at the time, but also to fill our database, basically, to say what has been happening across the country over a period of time, how things have changed. And so the data are really very important as we look forward to the research that we expect to do coming out of these events. And it is so unfortunate that with systems like Melissa moving through the area, we really don't realize that a lot of the data sets are also lost because we're losing the instruments that are recording those data information. The data that we really need to be collecting is being, we're losing the capacity to actually collect that data because of the loss of our automatic weather stations in particular, even some of the rainfall gauges that we have across the country. Those are what we use to assess even how intense the hurricane event was and other events, but also to move forward in the research. So the importance of our data is significant. And it's interesting how the systems like a Hurricane Melissa will take those away, we lose that, and it takes us so many years to be able to reestablish what is happening in the area by putting those stations back in place, replacing the sensors that were lost, or replacing the stations in their entirety. So the data, I'm sure Professor Weber, Professor Taylor, all of them at the university, and even the forestry department will recognize that the data is very important to what they do as they move forward.
And I saw Prof. Taylor coming in too.
Yes.
Sure. I actually think it's a good segue to the question that you asked me earlier, and I'll tell you why. I'm actually very buoyed by what I hear, for example, out of NEPA and forestry, because, and from Prof. Weber as well, because they're talking about the data and they're therefore saying, you know, listen, we know what we have in terms of these natural resources and you know, seagrass, mangroves, forestry cover. We know what they did during the hurricane. We therefore know their value. All right. So two things emerge out of that in my mind. It therefore means, as we are looking forward and you know, beginning to say, well, we know those lessons. How do we go forward? Well, one, we have to tout those things. So we have to get that information out there so that the point that Prof. Weber, you know, was making about conservation becomes important. So what we have now, part of the message about preparedness going forward, and I'm telling you, we're not just preparing for this year, we're preparing, is let us protect what we still have. But the bigger lesson, and I think this is where it links to what I was trying to say, is we know now that a lot of it was damaged. And so the starting point for preparation is actually not the same place as if we had never had a Melissa. And if the starting point for preparation is not the same place, then we need to make sure a couple of things. In the plans that are coming out, it recognizes that the starting point, if those mangroves are not there and will take 5 years to grow, then whatever plans we're putting in for Black River and the West have to start from that point. And there is the role for the public and for the NGOs to say, do the plans recognize that the starting point is not the same place, you know? And therefore, the coordination everything has to reflect that we are not in the same place with respect to the protection we would have gotten. And so any plan, any preparation going forward has to recognize we're not starting from the same place.
Okay, and again, y'all just providing all these wonderful segues and natural segues to what we want to move into, which is talking about community and environmental justice, because what I found coming out of Melissa is similar to what I think we saw during COVID, that it exposed vulnerabilities. The people who are most badly affected were the poor, the people whose lives were worst affected, the people for whom it took longest to return to any semblance of normality, and many still have not, were the poor. So what does that say to us about, you know, environmental justice, community resilience, and just helping those most vulnerable people in the context of the environment? And I do bring back here now Dr. Teresa Rodriguez Moody, because I know JET, along with many other NGOs, is very concerned about this issue of environmental justice. How did you see that play out?
Yes, you're right, Dion, in bringing that up, because, and this is a conversation that comes up in every context whenever there is a storm. The fact is, everybody is impacted by climate events, but not everybody is impacted equally. And this is where the whole justice aspect comes in. You know, we're seeing studies come out what speaks about the fact that persons that didn't own their land, didn't own the land on which they had their homes, were in some cases the most impacted. Why? Because the nature of the structure, you know, they couldn't put down permanent homes. They had to put down homes that could actually be moved. And that definitely impacted their ability to, you know, cope with such a major event. And so I think this is why when we're looking at Build Back, you know, we have to address some of those underlying issues. What are some of the issues that make communities and people more vulnerable You know, and this is why it's not, yes, you know, the environmental conversation is important, where people live, where they can afford to live, where they can afford to put their homes, but also in terms of, you know, women and children are more impacted. We have older people are more impacted. You know, this is also where data is important. Are we mapping that in a way that we understand and are able to, whenever there is a storm, or whenever there is an event that is approaching, how much of that information that is being mapped in terms of where are our vulnerable people, where are our more or lower income communities, and are we able to respond quickly? How are we going to help them and assist them? The nature of the assistance is important as well. We've seen where people not having a bank account impacts their ability to get aid after an event. So I think that this is a conversation that, you know, the whole issue of climate justice, environmental justice, I don't think is very well understood. Here is not spoken of enough in Jamaica, but I saw that it definitely really showed itself and played out in during Hurricane Melissa, after Hurricane Melissa. And I think that if we're going to be talking about resilience, we have to put vulnerable people, vulnerable groups and communities at the center of the conversation, and they need to be a part of the solutions going forward for their communities. They should not be told of what they're supposed to do or what should happen or where they're supposed to be moved. They need to be a part of the solution. We need to be aiming at reducing those vulnerabilities and in turn reducing those issues of injustice.
Prof. Taylor, can I bring you back in on this and ask you how this feeds into conversation, certainly elsewhere, if we're hearing we're not talking about it enough here, but what should that conversation look like?
Well, I think Teresa hit the nail on the head. The conversation clearly has to think about who those most vulnerable are, or what, because remember, the biodiversity itself is part of that vulnerable. Have we really mapped out who those vulnerable or what those vulnerable are, you know, and then not just leave it at data, you know, part of it is just not ending with data and collecting the data, but how we then translate that knowledge into action. Those conversations are happening elsewhere, and we need to see them happening more. I think what you can get from what I'm saying, I want to see them happening more quickly. The premise of this whole series is we are at the start of another hurricane season. And we're not, I think I'm trying to make the point with respect to biodiversity a while ago, we're not starting from the same place. And those who were most impacted and are most vulnerable and for whom justice is needed, they are starting from a whole step behind others. And there are other complications for this season. And so we have to take, so the person who still does not have electricity is now facing heat and potentially extreme heat. That's a real climate justice question. And so as we're planning out, you know, what we need to prepare, we don't have the luxury of you know, taking our time and doing, because the layering is happening and the injustice is getting worse. So some people have to be prioritized. That's one of the lessons that we have to learn. And the prioritization has to happen now. Now, I throw it to you. Do you see that happening? You know, I know you are the host, where you interact, you know, and if it is, then that's fine. You know, if we all get the sense, and the people themselves, as Teresa said, who are the most vulnerable, if they are seeing it, then that's fine. One last quick thing, I want to pick up on something Teresa had said. She says that we must make sure the communities are part of the conversation. I have a real question. Have we stopped to map the stories of those people who were most impacted and use those stories to guide the actions? Or are the actions all from people like me and you and people at a certain level who sit and say, well, our expert science knowledge tells us the actions? has there really been a wide-scale mapping of the memories and things? Not just for the sake of capturing them, though that is important to capture them, but to mine the gaps, to mine what was not done properly, where even if we had tried to do it properly, we hadn't thought about that because it just introduced a whole new. I have a little worry that as time goes by, and especially in a new hurricane season, if another hurricane should come, it's going to supplant those memories. And we need to get those voices if the actions we're putting on the ground in terms of preparedness are going to really meet the targets of, especially for those who have suffered the most under the climate justice question. Just throwing that out there to think about.
No, I think it's a fascinating question, because my sense is that we think of the recording of those stories as something we're doing for news, for journalism.
Exactly.
History, for all these other purposes, but in terms of connecting them to the actual work, I'm not sure I've ever heard it put that way. But since we have an actual regulator in the room, Anthony Mackenzie, just your thoughts on what we heard there.
Yes, I mean that's the real thing when the rubber hits the road. I don't know if I mean, from an EPA point of view, have all the answers, certainly not. But I mean, from a practical point of view, I mean, we were down in the Black River Party area sometime after the hurricane, working and looking and assessing the mangroves down there, cleaning, removing debris, and so on. And the issue with, I mean, the people, the local community was a bread and butter issue. Their survival, how that's the priority for them, and whether they make the connection between their survival and the state of the environment, and the connection between the environment and their resilience. I'm not too sure that based on that particular location, and I imagine that can be applied right across the country, that there's that connection. So there's still a lot of work to be done. Obviously, there has to be government intervention and support in the aftermath of hurricanes such as Melissa and any hurricane, as a matter of fact. There has to be that community support that's given so that people can build back their livelihoods, and then that you'd have that connection again in terms of their well-being and their connection to the environment. There's a small point in terms of, I mean, if you look at, I'm just using an example again, the question of our beaches and access. I mean, we collect data on an ongoing basis on beach width and beach change, just like what we collect data. And data is available. It's just that probably it's not available to a wide cross-section of our society as we like, and that is something that we need to work on, right? But in the case, and I mean, Prof. Weber had a slide that showed the buildings along Parati and the distance from the coastline. In some instances, those structures would have been there and with adequate width setback from the coastline, over 100 feet and 100 meters and so on. But over time, they would have been impacted by systems like hurricane and you have erosion. So again, that's like a point about access and justice, is that connection, I mean, is, I think, relevant.
All right, thanks so much for that. No, I know, go ahead, Prof.
Yeah, can I just throw something in there? So building on what both Teresa and Michael said, and most recently what Anthony said, I think in the whole build back, we have a responsibility to talk about the areas that are for communities, not just a housing community or a living community, but we need to build differently for our schools. Especially, I mean, that's where our children are, and they are vulnerable. And if we're going to keep using schools as shelters, then we need to figure out, okay, what are we going to do with that kind of building structure, knowing that the temperatures are going to change, are changing, knowing that we're going to have more of these strong hurricanes. Same with hospitals. How are we going to build them? Where? And how are we going to build them better? Infirmaries, the livelihoods that get affected, and especially the aged. So the two categories, children, the very young and the very old, are very susceptible in this, and we need to lay a special layer on to try and protect them.
All right, thanks so much. And I want to follow up on what all of you are saying. This comment, especially that Dr. Rodriguez Moody was making about communities needing to have a say. It seems to me a big part of that as well is how we facilitate grassroots advocacy and their involvement in governance generally. So, I mean, back in the day, you know, when I was in environmental management, and the management committees were a big thing when we just started the Montego Bay Marine Park, Blue and Jonker Mountains National Park, and it was a big excitement to have these very broad-based committees that, you know, community members would come and sit on. I know Mr. Smith has been sitting back and saying, all right, Dion, don't talk about forestry. I can I can relax, but I'm bringing you back here to ask you to what extent we are still having those kinds of community groups involved in, say, forestry management, and then I'll throw it open to the others as well, because I think having community groups that we are, you know, helping to build capacity, educate, helping them to develop their own voice means that when we have disasters like Melissa and other things, it's easier for them to step up, for people to step up, community members to start to speak. Mr. Smith?
All right. Thank you for that, Diane. That is very true. As the Forestry Department, our agenda has always been community engagement, simply because the resources we try to protect, and given the mandate we have and the manpower, we will require assistance. What we typically do is have what we have groups that are called local forest management committees. And these are basically groups of persons who live in and around forested areas, who can actually work with the Forestry Department to be the eyes and our ears on the ground. We do have forest technicians that are out. We do have rangers that are out. But I think for the entire island, our complement is less than 100 between the rangers and the technicians. So that is simply not enough. So engagement on a community level has always been something we've been striving to do. And I'm glad to report that we have actually taken the step a bit further in terms of going ahead and having some agreements lodged with some of our LFMCs. And in this situation, Dolphin Head is one. We have a co-management agreement, which not only sees the community being assisting us with giving us information as it relates to what's happening in the forest, but they actually have an actual stake in that they are part of the ownership of the reserve in terms of how the decisions are made, how in terms of anything that influences financial gains. So you not only have a community sitting on the sideline, but you have a community involved at the level where it stands to benefit them, not just environmentally, but financially. That is something we're doing. And as it relates to coming out of Melissa, you know that the Operation Relief is what we're using. And that's basically the government's mechanism to reforest post-Melissa. And one of the things about the relief system that makes it different from the traditional system is that it's people-centric. Normally, when we do reforestation in an area, we will go into the area, try and reach out to the communities in the area, try and push opportunities for public awareness and actual assisting us to do the reforestation. Under the relief program, we've stepped that up a notch. We've actually opened up the entire system where you can be a volunteer. You can live in Hanover or you can live in Portland and you can volunteer to do reforestation activities in any community across the island. So we do note that people being a part of the solution is very central to successful activities, and that's what we're pushing. We've always been people-centric from the days when we were doing the local forest communities and up to the relief pushing program now, which is people-centric.
I know JET also does a lot of work with communities and community groups and encourages advocacy. What do you think is missing?
You know, the example that Jerome spoke about with the LFMCs, you know, that's very good, but I think we need to see more of those. Here's the problem. When you see civil society organizations crucified in the media, you may not be so comfortable to want to let your voice be heard. And we're seeing a lot of that on various different issues. And I think that a lot of times community voices, civil society organizations, when they speak, they're almost seen as critical. You know, they're criticizing, but it's not being critical. It's in many cases, it's a cry for please listen to the point that we're trying to raise. Please engage with us and let's have dialogue. Don't be condescending. And I think that in some cases we see that organizations are allowed to speak and their opinions are sought out, but it doesn't happen all the time. And I think that this is where we need a lot of improvement. The most effective restoration happens when communities are recognized, not just as beneficiaries, but as co-managers of the environment that they depend on. And that requires a formal space, not just an informal consultation. Oftentimes, and you know, we think that you have a consultation, a one-off consultation, you present, this is what happens in EIAs oftentimes. The project is more or less decided on, we invite the community, let's hear your thoughts, and then we move on. And many times the community doesn't even know how their comments have been incorporated, taken into consideration. And I think that if we cannot talk about resilience without community. And that has to mean that we want to meaningfully being the keyword, meaningfully engage with the community and hear the comments. And I know that this might sound tedious for some, because, you know, that's a lot of work, that's a lot of communities, that's a lot of opinions. And how do you get all of that and incorporate all of that? But it can be done, it is done in other jurisdictions. And I think this is something that we need to be, our approach has to change with that.
I'm not going to go around the room on that one, because I think it's such an important point, because we're talking about moving forward. How do we more effectively involve community in that? Go ahead, Samaki.
Right. I mean, just on that point, I think even after Hurricane Melissa, when a lot of these community groups would have been impacted, I mean, individually as well, the individuals that would comprise these groups, we made a deliberate effort to offer financial support. So communities such as, or groups such as the Bluefields Friendly Society group, the Gallows Point group that's managed as fish sanctuary, the Alligator Pond group, CCAM, JCDT, Farmnut Safari, we made a special effort to provide support, financial support and otherwise, so that these groups would have not felt left out, and that there was support in the immediate post-hurricane period. So the point is that we recognize the importance of community groups and working with these community groups to ensure that the resources in a broader sense are supported in terms of the awareness of the community members in the wider context. So that's an important point.
Okay, Prof. Taylor, are you?
I don't want to agree about the importance of community. Actually, the thought that's really in my mind, especially when I listen to both, NEPA and I listen to JET and forestry, is that there are lots of different kind of groupings dealing with communities. Who joins the dots? If you understand what I am trying to say, so that we ensure that the groundswell of community voice reaches to the appropriate levels. So NEPA has a set of information, and JET will have a set, and the education people will have a set. Who joins those dots? That's a question I will leave.
Wow, okay. Prof. Weber?
Well, I think Prof. Taylor has kind of set the stage there in terms of who joins it. I think we all have a collective responsibility to do this. Now, we all work in many spheres. We all work in a place, but we all wear many hats. And we have the opportunity to join those dots by what we do. I know that looking at all the people on this call, I know that they all sit in other committees and on in other purposes where they can share that information. And you probably have the right set of people here, but we need more of that to happen outside of your sphere. So we're in education, and between our marine labs, we do over 2,000-3,000 students come through, as well as adults, to try and educate them about the environment. But at the same time, we try and take them all the way to say, okay, not just the environment, but how does this work for you? How does this work in your environment? So if you're going to be a fisher, what are the reactions there? What are the necessities that you need to think about? And take that back to your community. So most of the areas that we can work in, I think we have a responsibility to do the best we can from the knowledge base that we have. But yeah, we do need to talk to each other and spread some of that information.
Not leaving you out on this one, Evan Thompson. I think community affects everybody. Your thoughts from where you sit.
Sure, I was just thinking about it, because how the meteorological service would look at things is that the community is really dependent on to help us carry the message that we want to pass on in terms of forecasting and our warnings. So we engage a number of groups. Of course, we utilize the technology as well. So like even just WhatsApp groups getting to certain people, and then having groups formed by those persons who are represented in these WhatsApp groups, they also carry the message further. So we take it to the very last mile in ensuring that everyone is knowledgeable about what is going to impact them. And especially when we have special systems or special hazards, like, for instance, the storm surge that Black River so witnessed and experienced in this dramatic way. We were able to carry that kind of message by specifying that area that would have been impacted. But I think that we somewhat kind of jumped over one of the very important partners when it comes to community and carrying message and building the groundswell and joining those dots that we're talking about. And that's the media. Guess who we're talking about? Dion. But the media I find is a really critical partner when it comes to that joining of dots and the community and reaching people and ensuring that everyone is kind of brought to the same page, and I think all of us must interact with the media in a particular way so that we can help in the whole effort of building back this country and in spreading the word through our communities.
Let me put to you one of the comments I saw in the lead up to Melissa, because, obviously we know you guys do a fantastic job in terms of alerting us. It's like, 3, 4, 5 press conferences a day when Melissa was really approaching. But there was a concern as to whether the way in which the information is conveyed may not reach everybody. So, for instance, I found when I went into some of the Westmoreland communities, in particular, people are saying, boy, we think say it now go lick again. We'd hear say it go away and then we relax and think say it now go lick again. And people are saying, do we need to find a way to break it down even more? Those kinds of spaces, we don't normally use Jamaican language. Do we need, for instance, an Evan giving the information and then somebody else giving it in Jamaican to make sure it really reaching people? Is that something that the Met Office is thinking about at all?
It is. Actually, it's very much on our agenda or on our radar at this point in time, no pun intended. But we do actually have a program that's in place now because we have been mandated, not just the Met Service, but the World Meteorological Organization, which the Met Service belongs to or is a member of from Jamaica. We have the mandate from the United Nations to ensure that everybody is protected by early warning systems. And this means that the information must reach to every single individual on the planet. If there is any underserved community or if there is any underserved person, we have to find a way to reach them. So we have tried different strategies, when we think about, like, for instance, the deaf community, for example, and we chose to have a weather app that we thought, would basically be able to carry that message, and people are able to see in visual ways, how they are in graphic ways, what the warnings really mean, what the color coding actually helps to communicate, where is at greatest risk. So we try to reach people like those. You talk about the language. I've had discussions with the department at the University of the West Indies, linguistics department, about whether there is really the necessity to translate our messages to the Patois or the Jamaican language, you know, and there's a general feeling that everybody really understands the English as it is communicated, but do we really? And I went a little bit further in just the other day discussing with some researchers from King's College London about really doing some kind of research here to try to determine whether the early warning systems that we have really are enabling us to really reach everybody. And so they've been starting that research. They agreed to do it, and they've been interacting with a number of persons and institutions also to determine what kind of early warning systems we actually have in place to see whether we are actually fulfilling that mandate, because we have until 2027, the end of the year, to be able to say that this has been achieved and everybody in Jamaica is getting the messages and is aware of hazards and feel protected.
Okay, I mean, it's another whole conversation, but I mean, this idea, I would say that Jamaicans have that everybody understands English. It is not true. It is not true. The research has shown that it is not true, and you can just talk to people and you will see that it's not true. But another time for that.
Yes, okay.
Glad to hear that you are having those discussions. All right, so let me segue now into the final comments. Before we go to final comments, in terms of regulation and governance and policy, what kind of gaps did Melissa expose that perhaps we knew were there, but were made even more stark by Melissa? What do we need to plug? Which gaps we need to fill? And starting again with Jets.
I feel like I'm always on the hot seat.
Yeah, look, think of it like this. I see you as a Lorax, you speak for the trees. I hope the doctors out there, some people who know Dr. Zeus who follow you, but go ahead.
Right. Okay, so I think, as we've been hearing in the conversation, that the vulnerabilities that we're seeing didn't show up, wasn't caused by Hurricane Melissa, right? It was, Hurricane Melissa showed it up, highlighted these issues. And I think that what it has shown is that, and this is not new, we have environmental laws, we have the regulations. Do we need more? Yes, we don't have EIA regulations, for example. But what it really shows us is that we need to be enforcing the laws. We need to be using the information. All of this data that we talk about, how is that data informing the decision-making process? We need to use it more. I think that we've seen too many examples of where it is not being used appropriately, and we're seeing places that are being allowed to be built in areas that probably shouldn't be built. And we heard, for example, Mr. Mackenzie mentioned something about the data that is being collected about our coastlines. How is that information informing the decision-making process about what is allowed to take place and what is not allowed to take place in these different locations? So I think that we need to be, this is one of those things that I don't think it told us anything that we didn't know already. I think what it is telling us is that if we are serious about building our resilience and protecting our environment, protecting our and sustainable development, and I know that's a term that is thrown around a lot, and I don't think it is really and truly understood. It does mean that what is on paper in terms of our laws and our regulations, we do need to actually implement. We need to be more proactive about enforcing. We tend to be reactive. We see a lot of that in terms of the actions taken after something has taken place. And so that means that we need to have greater investment in the proactive, what I think Prof said, conservation is better than restoration. And that is something that's very important in terms of how we manage the environmental space.
And Prof. Weber, for you, gaps we need to fill or plug?
There are quite a few things that we are doing well that we need to take advantage of. So we protect what we know. So the knowledge is always going to be important. But should we be prioritizing where we're going to do? So every time we have a protected area, it gets special attention. Now, I suppose all of Jamaica could become a protected area over time. But why don't we say, okay, we're going to go for fish sanctuaries, for tourism zones, for shoreline protection. We're going to zone in on some areas, no pun intended in terms of zoning, but zone in on some areas that we're going to give special attention, get the legislation right and the implementation to make a difference. Then we need to fund. I mean, so many times we talk about funding being the issue, and we talk about short-term funding versus long-term and where the funding is coming from. We need to wrap our funding. Our biodiversity funding needs to be wrapped with our climate mitigation funding, with our disaster management funding, so that we get larger pools for specific zoned areas so that we can better manage those areas and then get them to coalesce over time. I don't think we're short on legislation, no. We're short on implementation.
Aye. Always the issue. Prof. Taylor, for you? Governance policy gaps we need to plug.
Well, you know, for me, I can't but help but think that there is some kind of gap with respect to standards, either standards or compliance of those standards. And that has to, you know, of course, that is also infrastructure. There's a gap to ask a question. Is the new science and what we know about climate change, what we know about El Niños built into the existing standards? And then there's a question of, even if it's not built in, do we comply with the existing standards? So I think there is a big gap there that we definitely have to plug. Maybe the other one that comes to mind is the protection of the most vulnerable. We think about, we have social protection for certain sets of people. You know, Melissa has exposed a whole new kind of set of vulnerable, even, you know, as Prof. Weber was saying, children in school and that. Is the protection adequate for the new kind of climate vulnerable? So I think those are two gaps that I think emerge.
Okay, and Mr. Mackenzie, from the perspective of Nepal, lessons learned that you think that in terms
Yes,
of...
I mean, there are lessons to be learned as well. I mean, if we look at it practically, the mangroves took a hard beating. I mean, if you travel along some of the coastal areas and you look at their present condition, you have to beg the question, what and how? And I mean, it has to be investigated more. I mean, we have some significant die-off. It might be that the hydrology has changed because of the impact of the hurricane, but as a result, that needs to be looked at. Even the physics of it. If you pass along, for example, that corridor into Montego Bay, the palm trees that were planted, right? They stood up and the leaves are there, but the mangroves around, they don't look all that good. But I think the bottom line is that we have to review the various standards and guidelines that we have now. We have, for example, the Coastal Management and Beach Restoration Guideline document that places a lot of emphasis on hybrid solutions for coastal protection. I mean, I think we're gonna have to face the real reality. Some of these coastal protection are going to have to be heavily engineered. Is it that our seagrass beds, is it that our coral reefs can withstand and face the treachery associated with these hurricanes alone and provide that protection? These are the reality that we have to face. This engineered hardcore structures might have to be relevant in some locations. And so, as I say, those guidelines, those standards, those hypotheses have to be reviewed and examined as we plan going forward. And I think we are seized in that regard.
One of the concerns and questions, though, Mr. Mackenzie, as I know you're very aware of, is whether we have those standards, we have those guidelines, are they being monitored? Are they being implemented? Or are the regulators, meaning NEPA, doing what you need to do in terms of ensuring that there is adherence to that, to those, before we go out and put out a whole new set and do even more work and produce more book and more document? And
Yes, yes, yes.
so is that kind of internal introspection and conversation taking place at NEPA to say, did we do what we should have done?
Yeah, yes, yes. That's the reality, the realism of it. We recognize that there are perhaps some institutional, I mean, and governance weaknesses and challenges as well that we have to face and that we are grappling with. The question, I mean, the simple question of whether or not development is being built or being located and is adhering to the requisite standards that have been stipulated, and the ability of us as regulators to monitor and to ensure that these standards and guidelines are enforced is, yeah, they are valid questions that we have to grapple with and face. And I think we are trying our best with these, I mean, for example, large developments to ensure that they're specifically targeted and that they're monitored to ensure that they meet the existing guidelines as they are.
Same question to you, Mr. Smith, for forestry. You know, is that internal conversation taking place? You know, did forestry do good to protect our forests? Do you need to do something different going forward?
Okay, thanks for that, Dion. I will start generally before I get to forest. I do, like stated by Professor Weber, I do believe that we are not short on policies and legislation. I do believe one of our weak points, our major weak points, is the enforcement of said policies and legislations. And secondarily, I think a lot of them need to be updated, because I know we have some policies that are dated as far back as the 50s, and that is almost 70 years ago. So a lot of the things we were planning for, anticipating back then, were not foreseen to be happening now. So as it relates to forestry, I'm proud to say that we do recognize that our policy, our Forest Act and our regulations are, I wouldn't say outdated, but are in need of update, and we are currently doing that. I think the opportunity Melissa gave us was that it actually gave us an opportunity to look at, you know, some introspection in terms of what the importance of maintaining our primary forests are. Because the main lesson as a forestry department we took from Melissa is that our forests are one of our greatest mitigators in terms of disaster risk reduction. And we saw where the primary forests actually did completely much better than the disturbed and the secondary forests. So we are saying now, looking at amending our regulations and our legislation and our act, we should be sure to ensure that the primary forests get the kind of protection they need. We do have in our policy a no net loss quote or section, but is that enough? Should we be doing more to actually get some of these disturbed broadleaf forests back to the original state of protected forests?
That's such an important point. I don't have time to follow up on it though, because we're just about out of time. But quick question, it can be just a yes or no answer, because Prof. Taylor is asking, are these various updates and policy updates taking place at a fast enough rate, he's asking, to accommodate the new climate reality? Mr. Smith, quick answer, and Mr. Mackenzie, and then I go around the room.
No, that's my quick answer. I don't think it's going as fast as it should. What I will say, it's turning a corner, because I can speak for the forestry department, University of the West Indies, and NEPA. We've actually been in a situation where we are now writing MOUs. We are able to join up not just capacities, but also resources to get effective work done on areas of agreed interest. Because we signed a MOU with NEPA in April, I think it was, Anthony, which basically speaks not just to support along project lines, but also data sharing, which was one of the critical gaps we had from before. So it's happening, but I don't think it's happening enough. Sorry, my no was so long.
No, that's fine. Mr. Mackenzie, you want to just answer quickly, and you can just lead into your final comments in terms of most important thing we need to be concentrating on going into this new hurricane season and beyond as your final comment.
Right. I think work needs to be done. There's no doubt about that. The reviews need to take place. I think, for example, even in terms of the watershed policy that was gazetted, well, that was passed as a white paper last year. I am not sure that the scale of climate impact was properly appreciated. And therefore, I think that could be applied to all our policies and guidelines. I mean, we have to benefit from the research and the experience and apply that in terms of how we review these guidelines and policies going forward. The beach policy, for example, was the first, I think, government policy, natural resource policy that considered climate change, but those discussions took place from in the 90s, right? And the policy is just coming out. So in terms of setbacks, I mean, that has to be totally looked at, right? So we have ways to go, but I mean, my closing point, all is not lost. I think we have to build from the ground up. We have to protect, but we have to restore as well. We have to support livelihoods. And I think once we support and try to affect behavior and bring about behavior change, then that is, in my mind, critical from a resource management and protection point of view.
All right. Yvonne Thompson, your final thoughts?
Yes, well, just to point out that these systems are really teaching us some new lessons. Beryl in 2024 taught us that June was not too soon. And then Melissa is telling us that October, it's not over, you know? So we're really learning that it's really a new way of looking at things. Climate changes are taking place and they are changing how we have to think. And we're also finding out that we can't focus too much on the numbers in the year, you know, how many systems will develop, because just one that we experienced last year was enough to take us through a number of years trying to recover. The main things I think, though, that we need to remember is that with the new climate reality, as Professor Taylor has pointed out, we have to think now more about how do we prepare for this new reality in terms of not each of us in our homes, but really as even the ministries, departments, and agencies. We now have to think the systems that we had in place to deal with these kinds of hazards. Now we're seeing much more severe hazards. What are the new measures we have to put in place? How much more, how much earlier do we need to put things in place just in case, you know, in terms that we talk about these hospitals that have to be established in short measure just to deal with the eventualities. How can we do these things much more quickly with this new reality? So we have to have a whole new way of thinking, and artificial intelligence is very real. That is what helped us with our forecasting, in particular for Melissa this year. And we're going to be seeing more and more of the artificial intelligence being incorporated into our models that is giving us better outputs and allowing us to prepare even faster.
Wow, fascinating. Prof. Weber.
I'm so glad I was asked to be a part of this panel, because for me, it gives me so much information to work with. I can tell you that so the answer is no. The short answer to what you say is no. But the Climate Change Advisory Board has just been reappointed, and there are a couple of members on this panel here who are on it. And from what we've discussed here, clearly one of the #1 things that the new advisory board will have to take on board and give advice to the minister and the government is how do we move the policies faster, but be sure that they are all climate sensitive. And as chairman, that's my commitment.
Okay, awesome. Mr. Smith?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Like Dr. Weber, I'm very glad I was on this panel. My closing words would be, as we move to build back post Melissa, as Evan said, there are a lot of lessons that have been learned. I think what we need to do is think outside the box. What traditionally works is not going to work for Melissa. I think from the forestry department's perspective, we've actually looked at reforestation in a different light. We've actually moved from just focusing on timber trees because we realize, especially after a disaster like this, food security is a part of the problem that needs to be solved. So under the relief program for phase 1, we've committed to putting 10% of the 300,000, that's 30,000 fruit trees. And this is something that was not a traditional forestry mandate. We were focused mostly on timber because that was our mandate. I think the lessons learned from systems like these is not just to change how we do things on the ground, but to change how we do things within government, inter and intra-agency. And that's a lesson I hope everyone takes from this as we move forward to recover.
Dr. Rodriguez-Moody.
Okay, so just to reiterate what Prof. Taylor said, we're not starting from the same place as we did before Hurricane Melissa, right? But in this conversation today, we've heard many times that comment said that lessons are, these lessons that are learned. Well, the lessons are only learned if we are going to incorporate them into the future planning and the decision-making process. Otherwise, we're just talking, right? So the lessons that we should have learned from Hurricane Melissa spoke to vulnerability, spoke to, including people in conversation, spoke to how we communicate with people. And I think that what I'd like to see going forward is all of those things that we said we've learned be incorporated into the next phase, into the decision-making process, into the next rebuilding phase that we're talking about. It's not only going to come from rebuilding what was lost. We have to change rules that allowed vulnerability to accumulate in the first place.
And Prof. Taylor.
Thank you very much. Actually, my last words are going to be kind of where I began. I just want to say we're at the beginning of a hurricane season. There is nothing about the next few months into the next year that is the same as we have seen before. If you think about the signs, we have a new mix of things which are going to layer. It's really different. If you think about then the starting point, as Teresa just, we're starting from a point of behind, and so no action that we are going to put in place going forward can look like the actions at the beginning of last year's hurricane season, because if we're starting from the point of behind. And then lastly, interestingly, we're starting with a different mode of action. It's a kind of first time in a long time that we're dealing with recovery plus preparation at the very same time. And we must be careful that we don't have two different bodies or two different sets of people dealing with recovery and the preparation. And that's completely, this is completely new. And so the recovery agencies have to talk to the preparation agencies and have to talk to the community. But if we do start recognizing that this is the beginning of something, we're not at the same, it's entirely new, then I have hope for where we'll be at the end of the season.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you all so much for an absolutely fascinating conversation. I had a little bit of a rough start, but once we got going, of course, conversation was really rich. The recommendations, the suggestions, the charges, the call to action in terms of moving forward. So thank you all so very much. Thanks to everybody who watched, and just want to let you know to look out, because we still have 4 left in this National Dialogue series that's going to be looking at other critical aspects of this issue of rebuilding Jamaica after Hurricane Melissa. I'm Dion Jackson Miller. Thank you again.